From the very first day Napoleon addressed the Senate as first consul, he made it clear that he had a new era in mind. A shrewd observer could have deduced a lot from significant little touches. A double row of troops lined the streets from the Tuileries to the Luxembourg Palace. An 8th-horse coach carried the first consul. Behind him came 6 more carriages, containing the second and third consuls, the ministers of state, and a military retinue designed to be representative of the whole army, generals, aides, inspector generals. At the foot of the steps of the Senate 10 of the elders greeted him deferentially. Napoleon was already aiming at a quasi-imperial style, and Josephine too was caught up in it. Now that she was the spouse of the first consul, Napoleon insisted on correct sexual behavior and refused to let her see any women of less than spotless behavior, which meant that all her old friends were excluded. The staff at Malmaison were under strict orders to admit nobody who did not have the oval ticket or laissez-passer signed by Bourrienne. But if he could curb her sexual promiscuity to some extent, Napoleon could do little about her profligate spending. Even with her various retainers from shady military suppliers and her lavish allowance from her husband, Josephine spent money like a woman possessed. She bought 900 dresses a year. At her most extravagant, Marie Antoinette bought no more than 170. And 1,000 pairs of gloves. When ordered by Napoleon to investigate her finances, Bourrienne discovered a bill for 38 hats in 1 month alone, another bill of 80 francs for feathers, and another of 800 francs for perfume. The incorrigible Josephine would regularly buy new jewelry and, when Napoleon commented on it, would claim she had had it for years. As in all such cases of husbands with wives, he believed her. Bourrienne discovered that Josephine's total debt was 0 francs, of which she admitted half. She told Bourrienne she could not face her husband's anger if he knew the truth and asked for his help. As predicted, Napoleon flew into a rage even when informed of the reduced figure of 600,000 francs. For the sake of his prestige he ordered the sum paid. Bourrienne then persuaded the various tradesmen to accept half. He pointed out that if they sued and the affair became public, Napoleon might be forced from office and they would receive nothing. Reluctantly the duped milliners and haberdashers settled. Almost at his wits' end with his wife's extravagance, Napoleon tried to persuade her to live a quiet life at Malmaison, where he encouraged her to entertain lavishly. Josephine was always a talented hostess, charming, kind, tactful, with a remarkable memory for names and faces. Malmaison symbolized part of Napoleon's new bearing. He had moved there from the Rue de Victoire on Cr November 1, 799, just after Brumaire. 3 months later, on the 19th of February R800, he made the transition from the quasi-republican to the quasi-imperial even more obvious by moving his official residence from the Luxembourg to the Tuileries, and spent his first night there occupying the bed last slept in by Louis XVI. By one of those curious twists for which the psychologist Carl Jung invented the term synchronicity, the very next day a letter arrived from Louis XVI's younger brother, Louis Stanislas Xavier, the future Louis XVIII. Louis assumed, as did so many Frenchmen at the time, that Napoleon's consulate was a brief interregnum before the inevitable restoration of the Bourbons. Napoleon, in short, was thought to be a kind of general monk making straight the ways for a return of the monarchy. Louis wrote to Haudenbas, "You are taking a long time to give me back my throne. There is a danger that you may miss the opportunity. Without me you cannot make France happy, while without you I can do nothing for France. So be quick and let me know what positions and dignities will satisfy you and your friends." Napoleon's prompt reply was devastatingly brief: "I have received your letter. I thank you for your kind remarks about myself. You must give up any hope of returning to France. You would have to pass over our 0 dead bodies, sacrifice your private interests to the peace and happiness of France. History will not forget. I am not untouched by the misfortunes of your family. I will gladly do what I can to make your retirement pleasant and undisturbed." 3 years later he suggested that Louis face facts and give up his claims to the French throne. Trusting to his star, the stubborn Bourbon refused. The perception that Napoleon intended to restore the Bourbons in R800 was odd, for by his vigorous suppression of the Vendée revolt he surely served notice of his intentions. The Vendée rebels were the military arm of Bourbon royalism, and, as soon as he was confirmed as first consul, Napoleon dealt harshly with them. Rejecting all overtures from the Vendéans, he announced there would be peace only when the rebels had submitted. He sent some of his best generals, including Brune, against them and won a string of military victories. One of the most important Vendée leaders, the Comte de Frot, surrendered with 6 other rebel luminaries, under the impression they had been offered safe conduct. They were executed at once, possibly because Frot had personally insulted the first consul in a manifesto. But Napoleon himself was not directly responsible. "I did not give the order," he said later, "but I cannot claim to be angered by its implementation." Disheartened by this act of treachery, dismayed by their run of military failures, and bitter towards the English, whom they accused of not providing the resources to make the rebellion in western France a serious threat, the Viennes signed a truce. For the rest of 1800, royalist opposition to Napoleon took the form of conspiracies and assassination plots. There was a plan by one of General Henriot's aides to assassinate Napoleon on the road to Malmaison. This aborted. There was the dagger plot of the 10th of October 1800, when Napoleon was to be stabbed to death with a stiletto in his box at the opera, but the ringleaders, the painter Topio Lebrun, the sculptor Siraki, and the adjutant General Arena, were rounded up and executed before the plot could be implemented. And there was the most serious assassination attempt of all, the machine infernale of December 1, 1800. On Christmas Eve 1800, Napoleon, Josephine and her family, together with Caroline Murat, were due to attend the opening of Haydn's Creation at the opera. Napoleon was in front in one coach with 3 of his generals, while Josephine, her daughter Hortense and Caroline Murat followed in the second. The royalists had rigged up an infernal machine, actually a bomb attached to a barrel of gunpowder concealed in a cart, and timed it to explode at the precise moment Napoleon and his entourage drove down the Rue Saint-Nicaise. 2 things thwarted a cunningly laid plot. The 2 carriages were supposed to keep close together, but the women's coach had been delayed when Josephine at the last moment decided to change a cashmere shawl. Meanwhile, a drunken coachman on Napoleon's carriage was driving at speed. A gap opened up between the 2 conveyances, and it was at that point that the device exploded, missing both carriages but killing or maiming 52 bystanders and some of the consul's escort. Napoleon continued to the opera as though nothing had happened. It was not only from royalists that the consul had to fear plots. The Jacobins were active too, especially in the army, where they could count on the support of generals like Bernadotte, Moreau, Augereau, Lecourbe, Delmas and Simon. Yet Napoleon was always kept well informed of Jacobin plots by his spies and made a point of sending dissident generals to remote foreign trouble spots, excepting only Bernadotte, who was Joseph's brother-in-law, and Désirée's husband, consistently got away with blatant disloyalty and even treason. The Jacobins' position was difficult, for press censorship made any propaganda offensive chimerical, and Napoleon, who detested the Jacobins far more than the royalists, did not hesitate to mete out execution and deportation, or to open mails and plant agents provocateurs. If ever Napoleon faced opposition from the legislature, he would cow them with his favorite threat: "Do you, then, want me to hand over to the Jacobins?" The one card the Jacobins held was that the loathsome Fouché, chief of police, was secretly on their side, systematically duplicitous, to the point where, when asked by Napoleon to keep Josephine under surveillance, Fouché secretly recruited her as an agent to report the goings-on in the first consul's household. Fouché covered up for his political comrades and directed Napoleon's attention towards the royalists, yet the sequel to the infernal machine showed Napoleon for once outfoxing the fox. He was determined to use the occasion to purge the left opposition and, despite reluctance from his colleagues, he forced through an extraordinary measure. 130 known Republicans were dubbed terrorist and proscribed without legal process. They were then either interned or sent to a slow death in Guyana and Devil's Island. An enraged Fouché took no more than a few days to bring Napoleon incontrovertible proof that the perpetrators of the infernal machine were royalists, not Republicans. Napoleon authorized the guillotining of the new batch of prisoners, but did not free the deported Jacobins. His cunning emerges in the wording of the emergency decree, which condemned the 130 Jacobins in phrases which referred to the safety of the state in general, not to the Christmas Eve outrage. Throughout the year 800, Napoleon proved himself a master at navigating the political shoals, playing off one party against another, now appearing to incline to the right, now to the left. He leaked his correspondence with Louis XVIII to the Jacobins to show that he had no royalist sympathies, then purged the Jacobins to reassure the right. The situation after Marengo even allowed him to jettison his Thermidorian rump of former supporters. Because Marengo was at first reported in Paris as a defeat, the partisans of Sieyes and Barras showed their hand openly, which allowed Napoleon to marginalize them when he returned to Paris. More importantly, it revealed to people at large that Napoleon and the other Brumairians were things apart. Napoleon thus not only avoided all the unpopularity currently felt towards the men of Brumaire, but was able to appear above faction and thus as national reconciler. It was always the threat from the right that most exercised the first consul, even before the infernal machine, and he decided to cut the ground from under their feet by co-opting their traditional supporter, the Catholic Church. This was yet another opportunity provided by Marengo, which in political if not military terms has claims to be considered one of Bonaparte's most decisive battles. When Napoleon seized power in November 1, 799, French Catholicism was in a parlous state. The Church had been under sustained attack for 10 years, first from the revolutionaries who equated it with the ancient regime and latterly from the blundering reformers of the Directory. The episcopate was for the most part in exile, and systematically counter-revolutionary. The expropriation of church property, and the institution of civil marriage left most of the priesthood irrevocably alienated, and even those priests who collaborated with the post-1789 regime had to heed the instructions of their emigre bishops. Under the Directory was no civil society, no middle range of institutions between the individual and the state. The Church therefore had a legal existence only as a collection of individual priests, which naturally weakened its position. Pius VI, a virtual prisoner of the Directory in Rome, was dying. The Church seemed to have reached the point of terminal crisis, but Napoleon knew that Catholicism was still a potent force among the peasantry, from whom he derived much of his support. He saw an important potential source of authority in the 40,000 priests who would support his regime if he came to an agreement with the Church. He also saw the short-term advantages of getting rid of a counter-revolutionary element which would also bind closely to him the emigre aristocracy and the middle classes. He needed to ensure that the Vendée did not break out again and to cut the ground from under Louis XVIII. Above all, Napoleon seriously considered that society could not exist without inequality of property. Only the Church could legitimate social inequality, for secular attempts to justify it would trigger revolution. There were two ways of going about the religious problem. Napoleon could allow the separation of Church and state to work itself out spontaneously, which would probably entail a de facto restoration of Catholicism, or he could actively seek a formal agreement with the Pope. On temperamental and political grounds, it was always likely that he would opt for the latter solution. He liked to stamp his authority on every aspect of national life, and, if the Church was to be restored, he personally wanted the credit for it. Hence the paradox of the vigor with which this man, with no love for Christianity per se, forced through an agreement with the papacy. After Marengo, Napoleon made immediate overtures to the new Pope Pius VII, who was elected after a protracted conclave on the 14th of March R800. The consul celebrated a Te Deum in Milan Cathedral on R8 June, and a week later, at Viersilia, informed Cardinal Martignana of his wish to come to an agreement with the Pope. The news was conveyed to Rome, where Pius VII at once accepted the principle of talks. Detailed negotiations opened in Paris in November, with Archbishop Spina of Corinth and the reformed Vendean Bernier as the principals on either side. Bernier, an accomplished diplomat, was under the direction of Talleyrand who, as an unfrocked priest, could not negotiate directly. At this time there were three groups in the French Catholic Church: the Constitutionals, who had made their peace with the Revolution early on, the Reformist Refractaires who had come to terms with Napoleon after Brumaire, and the Ultramontane faction of diehards. These three groups were mirrored within Napoleon's own circle by those who thought like him, those sympathetic to the Church who wanted to enshrine it as the state religion, and the crypto-Jacobins led by Fouché, who were violently anti-clerical and detested the entire project of rapprochement with Catholicism. This confused situation produced some remarkable ad hoc convergences. Both the devout and the anti-clerical party would have preferred no treaty with Rome but merely de facto separation of Church and state. The former thought religion would revive best this way, while the latter thought it would wither on the vine. The Constitutionals meanwhile thought Napoleon was on their side, but in his heart he preferred the authoritarian mentality of the Ultramontanes. He was suspicious of the insidious democracy of the Constitutional Church and the elections which the Constitution Civile had introduced. Bernier proved an inspired choice for the negotiations. There were three main obstacles to a general agreement. The first concerned the appointment of bishops, who should have the power to nominate to sees, and what about those who had fled or been forced to resign by previous popes? The second was the desire of Pius VII that Catholicism should be the state religion in France. The third, naturally, concerned the revolutionary confiscation of church property. 8 months of often acrimonious negotiations followed. Napoleon pretended sympathy for the idea of Catholicism as state religion but told the Pope that public opinion would not tolerate a return to the ancient regime in any form. Since those who had benefited from the sale of national property were the mainstay of Napoleon's regime, he could hardly grant the Pope's economic demands, but as a quid pro quo Napoleon offered to put all the clergy on a salary and treat them as state officials. A very decent compromise on the episcopate had almost been worked out when the venal Talleyrand spotted that married ex-clergy like himself would be at a disadvantage. He managed to intrigue to get the offending clauses scrapped. As the negotiations stretched out into R80R, attitudes on both sides hardened. After the infernal machine incident, Napoleon's desire for an agreement with the Catholic Church became more intense, and he grew impatient with the stalling tactics of the papacy. At one point he threatened a military occupation of Rome if Pius VII did not come to heel. The Pope, meanwhile, considered that Spina had already conceded too much and sent his Secretary of State, Consalvi, to Paris to conduct the talks. Two 11th-hour crises threatened to turn the proposed treaty into debacle. Consalvi tried to get a recantation from the bishops who were then in schism through having accepted the revolutionary Constitution Civile. Napoleon was outraged and angrily charged the papal delegate with not realizing the extent of Republican, Jacobin and army opposition he had had to overcome even to reach this point in the talks. Finally, a draft agreement was reached. But Bernier warned Consalvi that he was being asked to put his signature to a text which was not the one agreed. There were outraged protests from Consalvi. Napoleon, angry at having been caught in such an obvious deception, threw the draft treaty on the fire and dictated a ninth at speed, which he insisted had to be signed then and there without cavil. Consalvi refused and called Bonaparte's bluff. Napoleon appeared to back down and signed the Treaty of Concordat at midnight on Arrest July R 801. In a conciliatory preamble, Napoleon recognized the Roman Catholic faith as the religion of most French people. In the detailed articles that followed it was stipulated that French government and Holy See together would work out a new division of dioceses, that the first consul would nominate bishops to be ratified and invested by the Pope, and that in return for an oath of loyalty to the government the clergy would receive state salaries, without prejudice to the benefits churches could enjoy from endowments. The Pope considered the Concordat a great triumph. He ratified the treaty on the 15th of August R80R, and in the Bull Tam Multa he ordered the ultramontane bishops to resign. Pending the new reorganization of sees, most did so, but in the west of France a handful of rebels set up an anti-Concordat church, royalist and schismatic. The new dioceses were speedily agreed and bishops appointed in a spirit of compromise. 12 were former constitutionals, 16 former non-jurors and 32 new ones, including Bernier. The naive pontiff took it as a positive sign that Napoleon appointed his uncle Fesch, now a cardinal, as his ambassador to the Vatican. Pius VII took the view that with the Concordat schism had been avoided, the unity of the Church restored and its finances put on a sound footing. The attempt by the Revolution to exclude the French Church from papal influence had manifestly failed, and, having been invited to dismiss all existing bishops, the Pope now had a precedent for further interventions. Catholics in general gained from a state church in all but name, financial advantages, the end of schism and a privileged role in education. Above all, though, Pius VII felt that the impact of the Enlightenment and the Revolution had brought Catholicism close to collapse. In the context of a 10-year battering from revolutionary anticlericalism, Napoleon seemed like a godsend. Napoleon was satisfied that he had achieved most of his objectives, appeased the peasantry and torn the heart out of royalist resistance. Piqued at Consalvi's valiant rearguard action, he tacked on to the main protocol of the Concordat the so-called organic articles, which forbade the publication of any bull, pastoral letter or other communication from senior clergy without the permission of the French government. Further articles forbade unauthorized synods or unwanted papal legates, prescribed French dress for the clergy and ordained that the same catechism should be used in every work. In order to rebut the canard that the Concordat made Catholicism the state religion in all but name, Napoleon ordered Chaptal, his Minister of the Interior, to draw up further organic articles providing state salaries for Protestant pastors. The organic articles showed clearly that Napoleon was never really interested in genuine compromise, and that in effect he had duped Pius. Such a mentality did not bode well for future relations with the papacy. The Concordat was the purely political act of a man indifferent to religion but conscious of its role as social pacifier. It successfully neutralized royalist opposition for the next 8 years, to the point where the royalist Joseph de Maistre wrote, "With all my heart I wish death to the Pope in the same way and for the same reason I would wish it to my father were he to dishonor me tomorrow." Royalist wrath fell on Pius VII, not Napoleon. But the first consul had to face determined resistance from the opposite direction. The Concordat was construed as a gross offense to republican sentiment. The Council of State greeted its promulgation in silence. In the tribunate the treaty was mocked, the legislature pointedly elected an atheist as its president, and the Senate co-opted a leading constitutional who had opposed the accord. Resentment in the army was even more vociferous. Napoleon was able to ride out these waves of dissent because the Concordat was hugely popular with ordinary people, and especially the peasantry, who had now got its old church back but shorn of its feudal privileges. Radicals of all stripe thought the Concordat a mistake. Charles James Fox, talking to Napoleon after the Treaty of Amiens, blamed him for not insisting on a married clergy. Napoleon replied, "I wanted, and still want, to pacify. Theological volcanoes are to be quenched with water, not with oil. I should have found it less easy to introduce the Confession of Augsburg into my empire." Jacobins, and later historians sympathetic to them, saw the Concordat as the final betrayal of the Revolution. On this view, what had made France unable to throw off the claims of absolutism, despite the events of 1789–94, was the dead hand of Catholicism. And here was Napoleon making common cause with it, in a treaty signed by two separate despotisms. Some historians have even speculated that the Concordat was fundamentally un-French and that by concluding it Napoleon showed himself clearly a man of Italian sensibility, a true Constantine in his attitude to religion. Certainly the reopening of churches for general worship inflamed Jacobins wedded to Voltaire's aim of wipe out the infamy. The solemn Te Deum in Notre Dame Cathedral on Easter Day, the 18th of April 1802, held to celebrate the Concordat, degenerated into farce. Napoleon ordered all his generals to be present to display unity, but the idea backfired. The only ones in Napoleon's entourage who knew when to genuflect were the two defrocked clergymen, ex-Bishop Talleyrand and ex-Oratorian priest Fouch. The others went up and down at will. At the elevation of the host during the consecration, senior officers responded by presenting arms, and throughout the mass the booming voices of Lannes and Augereau could be heard chatting and laughing. After the service Napoleon asked one general how he thought it had gone. "Pretty monkish mummery," said the general. "The only thing missing were the million men who died to overthrow what you are now setting up again." The Concordat allowed Napoleon to take a more relaxed view of the royalist threat, and the first sign of his increased confidence was the law to permit emigrants to return. In 1802 amnesty was declared, allowing the return of all refugees from the revolution except those who had actually borne arms against France. It was to be a point of understanding that there would be no return of real estate already sold as national property. Some 40,000 emigrants or 40% of the total availed themselves of the opportunity, making Napoleon's rightward drift ever more evident. Josephine was a crypto-royalist and even corresponded with people who were officially enemies of the state. Napoleon, amused, indulged her but told Fouch to keep a close eye on her activities. A vicious circle was thus set up, wherein Fouch reported to Napoleon on Josephine and she reported to the chief of police on her husband.